Corinne, can you start recording?
Done.
Okay. All right, let's start. So, hello everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the GCSP webinar series on global crisis, global risk, and global consequences. My name is Jean-Marc Crickley. I'm head of global risk and resilience at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, GCSP. The GCSP is an international non-profit foundation physically based in Geneva, Switzerland, comprised of 52 states, including all the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the so-called P5. The GCSP mission is to promote peace and international security, as well as prepare and transform individuals and organizations so they can create a safer world. We are impartial, independent, and inclusive. We conduct and achieve a mandate through several parallel tracks through executive education, research, public discussion, as well as innovative fellowship program for executive in transition. Our community has grown substantially to 8,200 influential alumni in more than 165 countries in the world. When we started this webinar series 4 weeks ago, the coronavirus was approaching 1 million infection, and there were almost 48,000 people who had passed away of the COVID-19. This week, today, we have more than 2.6 million infection and more than 183,000 deaths worldwide. The topic of today has to do with the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on global terrorism and violent extremist groups. We have a very distinguished panel to talk about this issue today, comprised by Dr. Andrea Stoyan-Karadelli, Associate Fellow at the GCSP and visiting researcher at the University of South Wales. She will speak about the common denominator of both jihadi and far-right extremist groups in managing this crisis. Then we'll have Dr. Christina Shirley-Young, the head of terrorism and prevention of violent extremism at the GCSP. She will talk about far-right extremist movements. Then it will be followed by Mr. Christian Michelini, a former violent extremist that has since then left the white power movement and has dedicated his life to promoting projects like the Free Radical projects in order to create a network of global extremism prevention and disengagement. He has published 2 books, his memoir called White American Youth, as well as his second book, Breaking Hate, Confronting the New Culture of Extremism. Then Jean-Paul Roulier, the head of the Terrorism Joint Analysis Group, TJAG, at the GCSP, will focus on the way the COVID-19 crisis is being used as propaganda channels by jihadi, far-right, and far-left extremist movements. Jean-Pierre Keller, also from TJAG, Deputy and Senior Analyst at TJAG, will focus on the situation in the camps in northeast of Syria. And finally, Mr. Munir Zamir, counter-terrorism and counter-violent extremism consultant and PhD candidate at the University of South Wales, will focus on the jihadi perception of the COVID-19 crisis, as well emphasizing the way they perceive and operate during this crisis. Although the attention of most government are these days drawn by fighting the current COVID-19 crisis, it doesn't mean that traditional threats have disappeared. To the contrary, on April 17, the Department of Homeland Security, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, issued a nationwide notice saying it is imperative that law enforcement be alert for potential individuals triggered by the pandemic to inflict further harm. The alert noted that while there are currently no imminent or credible threats, there has been an increase in online hate speech intended to incite violence and or use the ongoing situation as an excuse to inflict hate. That's why federal authorities in the US have highlighted grocery stores, gas station, or even COVID-19 testing site as potential target by different terrorist organizations. It was the second warning in a few weeks by these authorities. In terms of global terrorism, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have provided guidelines for their followers to prevent the spread of the illness, but they also have used that to persuade new people to join their ranks and to promote recruitment. They also have tried to incite hatred, as well as Al-Qaeda has called on people, including those from the Western world, to use their time in self-isolation to convert to Islam. The Islamic State, in its newsletter on March 19, has urged its followers to take advantage of overburdened security capabilities to launch attacks. On March 23, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the most powerful Sunni jihadi groups in Syria, instructed its followers not to let the virus distract them from their fight against Shiites and other non-believers. On April 15, the Maldives was the victim of the first terror attack by ISIS. It destroyed 5 speedboats and 2 dinghies. It was the first time ISIS claimed responsibility for an attack in the Maldives, and the attack coincided with the first cases of community spread of COVID-19 in the country. 2 days ago, one of Europe's most high-profile ISIS terrorists, Abdelmajid Abdelbari, was arrested in Spain. And Spanish security forces said that he and 2 associates used the coronavirus outbreak to sneak into the country and wear surgical masks to disguise their appearances. But this is not just global jihadi groups that are benefiting or trying to use this crisis. Extreme right and left movement are also trying to use that to their benefits. Groups like the Nordic Resistance, Hundred Handers, have thought to increase their membership by capitalizing on the pandemic, and Generation Identity has used this crisis to promote European ethno-nationalism. These groups use Telegram as a main way to communicate their messages. As Americans are staying home to stem the spread of the coronavirus, online searches for white supremacist content have increased. In states that have had local stay-at-home orders in place for 10 or more days, there has been a 21% average increase in engagement with violent extremist content. Those responsible for the study mentioned also that nationwide in the US, they found a 13% increase. Far-right groups, so-called accelerationist groups, believes to sow chaos and violence will hasten the collapse of society, allowing them to build a white supremacist world in its place. Last month, the FBI warned that such extremist groups were encouraging members to deliberately spread the virus to Jewish people and police officers. Meanwhile, the International Crisis Group has warned that the pandemic threatens global solidarity in fighting extremists, allowing jihadists and other groups to better prepare spectacular terror attacks. So as you can see, this topic is of high relevance. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a very distinguished panel to talk about that. So without further ado, we'll start with Dr. Andrea Stoyan-Caradelli. Andrea, please unmute your mic.
Okay.
Yeah,
hello, everyone. I'm sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen? Is that all right?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you very much, JC, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be among friends. So I got the task to break the ice and provide you with the framework regarding the impact on the global terrorism that COVID-19 has had. So I thought that it would be really good to be focused and provide you with some key words that represent the whole response that global terrorism has had to COVID-19. And first of all, we have uncertainty created by the spread of the virus. Then we've had fear. Of course, fear is the worst, actually. Daesh has mentioned several times that even more dangerous than COVID-19 is actually the fear coming from COVID-19. These two represented the perfect opportunity for terrorist groups to reinforce their strategy, to reinforce their speech, their rhetorics, and call for action. Then we have isolation that has several consequences at psychological, social, economic, political, and so on levels, and can eventually lead to chaos, to lack of trust. And all these are easily manipulated by the terrorist groups on social media. So let me begin by providing you with the main common traits that we have witnessed in terrorist response to COVID-19. First of all, we have the reinforcing hate speech. And that's a trait that we have witnessed among all the wide spectrum of ideologies. They have used the virus as an element to reinforce their ideology, their perspectives, and to validate them. They've done it in several ways. For example, Daesh sold the virus as a crusader, a soldier of Allah, who came as a punishment for the crusaders. So each group has used it in order to legitimize their own ideologies. Secondly, we have disinformation and extremist propaganda. We've witnessed a lot after the appearance of COVID-19 in the form of misguiding information, intentionally and unintentionally, fake news, conspiracy theories, especially in right wing, and hate speech that is directed to several target communities, such as the Asian community because of the origin of the virus, or the Jews community, the Jewish communities, just because it was a target before it as well. And then we have what I would call the most important, and those are the calls for action. The calls for action in order to conduct attacks, to seize the opportunity, to use the momentum, and attack the designated enemy, different from, that it's different from one group to another. Attack it now when it is most vulnerable. So we have those three main traits that actually are pretty much similar, and in terms of rhetoric, strategy, and means, those groups are pretty much the same. But when it comes to the responses, there are particular traces that we can see, we can witness in terms of their capacities and local circumstances. In terms of particular traits, we'll have a look at three main groups. We have Salafi Jihadi, right wing, and left wing. So Salafi Jihadi, I was telling you about the religious rhetoric, about the example with the soldier of Allah. The pandemic came up as a punishment. We have to use it against, the crusaders. We have to use it to reinforce our rhetorics. They've been using religious texts a lot, not just by, in order to make the propaganda of the virus, but at the same time to inform their members and their sympathizers regarding, the health part of it, as in the way they can protect themselves. They've used hadith from the time of the Prophet. They've been using information even from the international organizations such as WHO, but at the same time, they've been also using information that was not real, in order to propagate fear. We also have calls for action when it comes to Salafi Jihadis. And if we take the example of Daesh, you would witness first calls to conduct attacks now when their enemies are at the most vulnerable moment. And secondly, and maybe most important, they are calling their members to free the militants or their families that are now in prisons and camps in Iraq and Syria. And that's a very hard card that they need, because right now, the international community, and it's not just something that appeared after COVID-19, but it happened before that. We don't manage the situation in Syria and Iraq, the situation in those camps and prisons correctly. Then we have politicizing the virus. You'd see groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria or the Taliban who are politicizing, using the virus in order to take control and show that they have control over the population. Now, when it comes to right-wing groups, you would see extremist groups, you would see a lot of conspiracy theories that are reinforced by the virus. You would see a lot of hate speech, especially towards certain communities. I was mentioning the Asian and the Jews. You would see a lot of anti-foreigner and anti-immigration rhetoric. You would see them blaming the failure of the neoliberal system just because of the spread of the virus. And when it comes to call for action, I would say that those are the most worrying propaganda that we can witness, because they call for mass infection of the enemies. They call for transforming the virus into a weapon, a very cheap one actually, either by weaponizing our own illness, or going and spreading the virus if we've got it, or spraying it in a bottle of fluids that contain it. So this is actually one of the most worrying call for action that we can witness. The left wing has also blamed the destructive nature of capitalism. They have blamed the measures that have been taken by the governments in order to contain the virus, saying that they are taking away our liberties and depose authoritarian rule. They called for action of creating chaos, plundering, destroying the businesses in order to accelerate capitalism's downfall. So because of the very short time that we've got, I want you to take three main takeaways from this presentation that begins the webinar. First of all, you have to understand that all those groups, although they seem to be strategical enemies, they're actually pretty much rhetorical allies. And this is witnessed in terms of the way they use COVID-19 as an opportunity to validate their rhetorics and to make a call for action in order to attack and spread violence and fear. Then you have to pay attention to the way disinformation plays a huge role in polarization and fostering emotional insecurity that is actually manipulated by those groups in order to recruit more people. We have also witnessing new targets because the whole political scene has changed. The old public spaces that have been used are not an option anymore. So the new easy targets that we witness are hospitals and care houses. And we also see the virus, or the call for action, in terms of using the virus as a weapon. The last takeaway that we have to understand and we have to pay attention to is the fact that with the COVID-19, the problems that we had in our societies has not disappeared. They actually got more intense, and they have been empowered by the spread of the virus. So the COVID-19 pandemic has the potential to now weaken domestic security efforts and international counter-terrorism cooperation, providing a window for those groups to better prepare attacks, to hit us when we are most vulnerable, and to escalate campaigns of insurgent warfare on battlefields worldwide. So the last thing that I would like to mention are four main recommendations that I could make based on the research that I've taken so far. First, and this is not just on the current situation, but in general, we have to ensure an equal treatment of those groups. This regards the ideological spectrum. They are all dangerous. They are all equally dangerous. We have to ensure a better data collection when it comes to COVID-19 during the pandemic and afterwards. We have to provide a strategy for better data collection on domestic terrorism and hate crimes. We need to monitor terrorist footprints, which actually are spreading and they're mutating like the virus, adapting to the new context. Then we have to develop strategies to identify, monitor, and of course, remove those disinformation, misguiding information that extremist propaganda has been spreading. And we also have to focus, because we've been pretty good at this, but we have to focus more on the gray area material, the one that is not immediately automatically removed. And last but not least, and this is not just for CT, but in general when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis, now more than ever before, it is the moment to develop a multidisciplinary understanding and a strategy, a multidisciplinary strategy that encompasses perspectives from all spheres of our lives that have been kind of affected by this crisis: psychological, social, economic, political, educational, medical, anthropological, cultural, administrative. This is the moment when we need it the most, and that means people from several disciplines working together to provide recommendations for what is needed to be done next. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'll pass the floor.
Thank you, Andrea. That was absolutely Fascinating. So basically, what you highlighted was that these groups are basically using the rhetoric to disseminate their messages, but also call for actions in terms of attacks or weaponization of the virus, or even destruction of businesses. And you ended up with a conclusion that there is a need for multidisciplinary research to link what these groups are doing. We'll probably return to that in the question and answer. For our viewers, you can have the opportunity to ask questions to the speakers. At the end, we will have 1 or 2 rounds of question and answer. The next speaker is Christina Sherry-Liang, Head of Tourism and PV at the GCSP. Christina.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Hello, everyone. I would like to address the question today about far-right terrorism, whether or not it's a global security threat. I will also look at how global far-right terrorism is manifested. And then I will talk a little bit about what are solutions and how can we deal with the crisis now that COVID-19 has made it an even greater threat. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight that right-wing terrorism is on the rise in the US and across Europe and also in Oceania. You can see here from the slide that there have been over 350 white extremist terrorist attacks since 2011 in these 3 areas of the world. And according to the 2019 Global Terrorism Index, which has been put out by the Institute for Economics and Peace, the total number of extreme right incidents has risen 320% in the past 5 years. So this shows that it is truly becoming a global issue and a global threat. Next slide, please. So why is it becoming such a global threat? I wanted to highlight some of the issues. So first of all, one of the first trends that you can see is that are committed by white supremacist groups is that they are becoming, the number is becoming greater, and there's several factors driving this phenomenon. First of all, the increased use of social media, the internet, and even the traveling to different parts of the world. But as well, the background of this was, of course, the election of President Barack Obama, as well as the election of President Donald Trump, the Brexit referendum, a spate of Islamic State-inspired attacks, and the arrival of large numbers of refugees to Europe from war-torn Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. All these issues have used, the extreme right has used to capitalize on fear and anger, and has used it to generate more terrorist attacks. And we can see what is new about their new modus operandi is that they're now starting to follow a typical 3-pronged attack in their modus operandi. First, they post a manifesto where they put on an image board some of the far-right content, some of their nihilistic memes. Interestingly enough, they use Pepe the Frog as one of their memes. And they also are targeting groups at gunpoint and trying to live stream the event. And then at the end, they call for imitation. They ask copycats to follow what they've done. They even highlight what went wrong and what they should be done better. And so this is one of the things. Another thing that you can see more and more now, that these online groups are not necessarily political, but in a way they're also coming together through pop culture. They use the Matrix, they use infantile humor, they use neo-Nazi symbols, and sometimes they just use blatant contempt of humanity. Next slide, please. One of their goals is to create Aryan nations or islands or foreigner-free zones. And they're focusing on issues like they speak about there's an alleged inferiority of non-whites. They are calling for lone wolf attacks. And they're now using, of course, the COVID-19 to call for attacking police officers, Jews, Chinese, Italians. And of course, as was highlighted by others already in the group, they're talking about ideas like coughing on doorknobs, spraying saliva on police officers, even turning themselves into bioweapons. And one of the things that COVID-19 has sparked is also this idea of this acceleration to a race war. We saw already with 9/11 that this was the beginning, in a sense, that many of the white supremacist groups, when 9/11 occurred, were upset that it wasn't actually them, that they had not committed the crime, because they were literally calling for a race war. And of course, they're propagating conspiracy theories. Next slide, please. So one of the priorities, of course, that we have to take in order to circumvent these issues, one is, of course, is to protect soft targets. One of the things that they are now doing due to the COVID-19 is they're targeting hospitals and medical workers, houses of worship, mosques, temples, and churches. And this, of course, is extremely worrisome. But there are many, many useful documents that I've highlighted here that can be used to make soft targets like churches, like places of worship, more protected. And you can see here, for example, the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office of the United Kingdom have developed the Crowded Places Guidance, which covers the 12 sectors, including stadia and places of worship. The French have the Vigipirate plan. There's a guide for critical infrastructure protection by the National Department of National Security. And of course, there's the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency that has also done a very good job of providing guidance on how to protect soft targets. Another very important step would be to identify some of these domestic terrorists, as they call them in the United States, as foreign terrorist organizations, since they are sometimes networked up to 18 different countries. And we need to see this issue also as was mentioned by Andrea, as a public health threat, because we are seeing that more and more young people are now feeling very anxious. They are at home and they're looking at their computer, and they're highly vulnerable to the kind of messaging that these groups are playing up. Next slide, please. One of the things that is the most, I think, disgusting part of these groups is that they're actually trying to attract youth, going through the games that they play, using memes. So it's one of the things, the best way to deal with this is to give young people digital literacy programs in schools, help enhance critical thinking skills, help them to stop being manipulated by these extremists online, and also building de-radicalization projects that use social media to analyze and to identify and engage with radicalized individuals. And finally, also to counter disinformation initiatives, fact checkers, social media campaigners to debunk online manipulation. And what we do at the Geneva Center for Security Policy is to create courses on preventing violent extremism and to help countries design national action plans that cover a whole of society and whole of government approaches. Next slide, please. Finally, it's really important to address the dark web and the deep web, where they are now hiding, and have more and more rules based on how to see what they're doing in these domains. Next slide, please. One of the things that also needs to be done in the digital domain is there's law enforcement now for Twitter and Facebook and Google, where they're now self-policing. But what these groups are doing is they're going to the smaller platforms. So there needs to be more an oversight on some of the smaller platforms. At the same time, we need more unifying national leadership. We need better leadership, more communication to build a sense of community, to stop the splintering polarization that is happening across many countries due to the fears that COVID-19 is creating. And build alliances between politicians, corporate society, and workers. but most of all, trying to counteract some of the hate speech, because it really is the social media and the internet that is feeding this new kind of wave of extremism. Next slide. And finally, one of the most important things is to present to the world that we are all together and we're pushing human solidarity. I think some of the initiatives that have happened already through music, the World Together at Home, the America's Food Fund that is pushed by Leonardo DiCaprio, even a simple meatballs recipe by IKEA that has been put out recently on the internet, are signs that we need to show hope, that we are together, that our healthcare workers are working for us, Médecins Sans Frontières, the ICRC, all these very important actors are showing that we are all sharing the same virus, and we all need to share, and we all need to fix it together. And finally, last slide, I think one of the most important messages that we all have to share is this: we have really two choices. We can either go at it alone or we can face this crisis together. So thank you for listening in.
Thank you, Christina. If I want to summarize your talk, it's basically you warn us against the role of the role of digital hygiene, that these groups are using social media as a way for recruitment to spread the ideology and propaganda. You're calling for increasing protecting soft targets and the young population, as well as the global leadership that is both from governments and from the corporate sector. The next speaker, Christian Michelini, will probably share with us his experience as a former activist in these groups. Christian?
Hi, everybody. It's good to see everybody. I know we're all sequestered. Blessed Ramadan to everybody. I'm not going to share my presentation. I'm just going to talk through it because I was having an issue sharing. For those that don't know me, my name's Christian. 30 years ago, and a little over 30 years ago, in 1987, I was recruited into America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group. I was 14 years old at the time, and I spent 8 years until the time I was 23 years old as a member of that group. Eventually became one of its leaders and went on to form a propaganda band that put out racist music before touring the world around 1990, 1991 with that. I was 14 years old when I was recruited, so it wasn't the ideology that drew me in. It was really a sense of identity, community, and purpose that I was searching for. And in fact, in the project that I work with now, the Free Radicals Project, where we help pull people out of hate groups and extremism, what we found is that most people, if not all people who are attracted to these types of movements do so, not necessarily because of the ideology, but because of a search for identity, community, and purpose. Eventually, I was able to get out through interaction with the people that I thought I hated. I had kept myself separate from them for 8 years, never given myself the opportunity to interact or to try and understand the people I thought I hated, until I was put in a situation where I had that opportunity, and I realized that I had been demonizing people instead of humanizing them without really knowing what they were about. And through the we've heard public health approach talked about, and through the Free Radicals Project, that's exactly how we approach disengagement, is through a public health approach. We do so by trying to repair the foundation underneath people, knowing that it's their life's potholes that kind of detoured them to the fringes where they found those narratives. So we apply things like therapy or job training or life coaching, mentoring, things like that, to try and help people disengage from that, and we've been very successful. We've helped over 300 people disengage from extremist groups because of that. What I'm seeing happening now in terms of the pandemic and COVID-19 is it's kind of the perfect storm for extremist groups right now. Andrea mentioned uncertainty and fear being the biggest drivers for this, and I couldn't agree more with that. When there is uncertainty or when there is fear, people tend to look for options outside of the norm, and it's also the time when extremist groups are the loudest, trying to provide those options through things like conspiracy theories, fake news, and propaganda. What we're seeing happening now, because of all this, the uncertainty and fear, specifically on the far right, and that's what I'm going to focus on, is that the propagandists have come out in full force. People like Alex Jones, some of the more typical larger scale propaganda operations have moved to doing a couple of things. One, blaming the virus on an ethnic group. So in terms of calling it the Chinese virus, things like that. So making it a racist virus, painting it in a xenophobic way. But they're also using it as an opportunity to tell their followers that the government is taking their rights away. So there's this whole kind of idea that that the government is clamping down more, and this is typically a group that followers don't trust already. So when governments start to put in other rules like stay-at-home orders and things like that, they try to paint that as a way that the government is taking their rights away from them, rallying supporters. We've seen a lot of stay-at-home protests on some of the Capitol steps in some of our states, where groups, anything from the Oath Keepers to the Three Percenters to the Proud Boys, have shown up, both to kind of protest and make a statement, but also to bring weapons and to strike fear just through the imagery that's there. Groups like the Proud Boys have staged shutdowns at some of the protests, even shutdowns near some of the hospitals and first responders. So they've stopped intersections so ambulances couldn't get through, things like that. There's been some talk with the accelerationists of weaponizing the COVID-19 by, if they were to get infected, they would then go out and spread it further. But what I'm mostly seeing, and I wish there's one photo that I wish I could show you, but and it is white supremacists attending some of these rallies, holding signs that say, the real plague, and then it's a picture of a rat with a Star of David on it. So they're trying to now paint this as not just a health plague, but a social plague brought on by certain other people. I'm going to use my last 2 minutes just to kind of really highlight some of the things that I want to warn people about. While we think about, attacks and things against soft targets happening during pandemics and times of crisis like this, what I would really like to warn people about is how they are recruiting online during this time, because so many, well, we're all online now more than ever because we're all home and we're finding our community through virtual spaces. So historically, white supremacists and extreme right actors have, in the time of the internet, recruited online. So they've gone now to multiplayer online gaming platforms where our children are talking to each other with headsets, playing multiplayer games. It's not the content of the games that's radicalizing people, it's the recruiters that are online with them that are in groups of say 30 or 40 people that might be playing a Call of Duty game. The way that they recruit is they'll say something like the N-word, or they'll say something racist, and they'll gauge how people respond to that who are playing the game. Some people may push back, some people may say nothing at all, and some people may actually laugh along or say something additional. Well, they then start to take those people and they filter those people who've responded positively, even if it is a nervous laugh, they invite them to other groups, and then they keep making that group smaller and smaller and smaller until they become these propaganda units, essentially. They're also trolling and recruiting in places like autism forums, depression forums online, where they know there are vulnerable people there who gather, who might be looking for connection with other people, who may have had trouble establishing social networks in the past in real life, and then in the virtual world, they kind of draw them in to be able to establish that sense of identity, community, and purpose. So though, while we're all sitting at home, while we're all online, while we're all disconnected from real people in a real way, they have completely ramped up their ability to recruit, propagandize, and do everything online. So that's really what concerns me the most right now. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So also very dense contribution. So you ended up with, again, reaffirming the risk of online radicalization as well as recruitment, that this group actually using games in the chat forum to actually try to bring new recruits. But you also mentioned that basically the situation we're in now is a perfect storm because of uncertainty, because of the fact that people are locked in, and there has been a lot of blaming game as well as staging protests in order to sow chaos and division. I think that it's also one of the common point between global jihadist movement as well as far right or left extremist group is this idea of creating chaos, because in chaos they strive. The next speaker is Jean-Paul Roulier, the head of TJAC. Jean-Paul, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. I will now begin my presentation, and it's going to be about all the three kind of extremisms we've spoken this afternoon and how they use propaganda online. First remark is to let you know that basically we are facing people that follow the events. So here, if you look at either jihadists or if you look at far right or far left extremists, all these people have had to deal first with, the reality of the COVID pandemic. Then they all had to watch, information, and then they could initiate in their, with their style, with their basic needs, they had to initiate the cycle of propaganda. Let me also remind you, for the second thing, that communication is the life and blood of terrorism. And when it comes to communicating, terrorist groups, be they from far right, far left, or jihadi, just want first to disseminate their propaganda. They want their propaganda, their narrative lines, to be disseminated internally, but also to the outside world. And they do this using different kind of documents. I just present you here the AQ first, official document on the COVID crisis. By the way,
Jean-Paul,
yeah,
you should share a screen.
I didn't share my screen. Okay.
No, we don't see your screen.
Wait a second.
Share your presentation.
It tells me that it can't show you. I can't show you my screen. I don't know why. That's going to be difficult. Do you see me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so let's go back here and begin what I said to you about, sorry for that, what I said to you about the life and blood of terrorism. So I told you that they want to disseminate their propaganda. As examples, I will take two documents. The first one being the first document produced by Al-Qaeda on the coronavirus pandemic. And this is interesting because most of the, I would say, strategy and most of the narrative that Al-Qaeda has developed can be found in that document. So it's a document that is both addressed to the inner circles, to the people belonging to the organization, but also to people from the outside world. Of course, the backbone of that document is the religious perception of what coronavirus is. I mean, the way they have, being Muslims, to behave, because of the pandemic, but also the way that the pandemic is striking, the unbelievers. And maybe this is at least a suggestion made by Al-Qaeda, the way we unbelievers should convert because of that pandemic. Most of you have already maybe seen that another document, which is the magazine of the Islamic State. That was one of the first infographics they disseminated about the way to deal with the pandemics, and using Sharia directives to do it. All these documents are official documents. So these are documents that were produced by the organization. Terrorism is also communicating operationally. Again, there is an internal communication and an external communication. Here, operationally, you see an example of a document that was photographed by a muhajirat, by an IS, a woman that was detained, that is detained in the camp of northeast of Syria, and she's also communicating that kind of things with her family using Telegram channels that are specifically dedicated to the Al-Hol al-Rosh camp. But this is going to be the topic of Jean-Pierre that will speak after me. And of course, you will have the operational use, trying to incite, to inspire, trying to recruit, and trying to train people. This is what you can find on one of the platforms, which is not Telegram, by the way, but this is what you would find on a platform used by the Islamic State. You will also find that kind of thing. So you have the official speeches produced by the leadership of the groups, and then you have, you know, the sympathizers, the people that are said to be the disseminators that will take over the dissemination and also the creation of propaganda. Andrea said before that most of what has been created when it comes to COVID was also reinforcing, you know, the ideology, reinforcing, let's say, the narrative lines of these different groups. If you look at the Islamic State, this is what you see. Fear. Fear is what is written, what is underlined in that editorial of An-Naba issue 226. And you have that mention of fear in the An-Naba, and then sympathizers and disseminators will produce the kind of documents you see below, or documents like this one, which again is a document that comes from the mainstream medias. You know, these are the so-called trucks that were traveling around an Italian town, but this is the kind of documents you will see used by Islamic State on their Telegram channel here, just to instill and disseminate fear inside of the unbelievers. They also use other narrative lines to connect them with the question of the coronavirus. Here it's connecting, you know, the pandemic and the wrath of God on the unbelievers with what the unbelievers inflicted to the Muslims and to the IS members in Bahus last year when the Islamic State officially fell. You will also have, you know, the question of security, which is mentioned in that editorial and which is then transformed into memes, into, you know, kind of infographics like the one you see here. You will again have the idea of instilling fear inside of the unbelievers, you know, populations, to make sure that even under COVID, there still are people that will be able and willing to attack. That kind of speech is going to be the case again for far-right extremists. What you see here is one infographic that comes from one of the Atomwaffen Division channels. Basically, again, when it comes to far-right, as it has already been said by Christian, I mean, you're facing people that wants to provoke, you know, to push the societies to a conflict, to a clash. This is what the kind of memes, the kind of infographics you will find. And if you look on the right side of the screen, you see, you know, something that comes from a far-right channel from Germany. And, you know, this is the idea of accelerationism and also survivalism, where, you know, in times of coronavirus, knowing the uncertainties that they are in the societies, you will maybe need that kind of material. By the way, we did not make any research on that, but I wonder who is going to take the money out of the things that you can buy online. I also, maybe a bit more, I would say difficult, but this is what you can find right now on far-right channels. It's not only buying an axe or trying to buy a pepper spray. This is clearly the way for you to make, using a 3D printer, to make a weapon in your kitchen. And that kind of document, we're speaking here about a 10 gigabyte, let's say a tutorial, which is accessible using certain far-right extremists channels. Last but not least, I want you to take care of Nordic, you know, the Nordic Union. These people are considered to be one of the most active group, far-right active group in Northern Europe. And by the way, regularly, at least once a week, they were the ones that have produced, you can see down there on the infographic on the left, you can see that they produced coronavirus, you know, videos nearly every week since the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, they are disseminating the classical far-right speeches and let's say topics that we are used and that have been discussed already by Christian and by Christina. Last but not least, the way they are using memes and infographics. This is what you will find on some of their channels, again, when you are monitoring what they do. And you will see something of the same kind, although a bit more controlled, I would say, and refrained, that is done by the far left. Far left, you know, putting together different topics that are of their, volition, like, disinfection, the reference to virus, but also capitalism, racism. These are very basic topics that have been used by the far left. You will also find that kind of, let's say, tutorials, how to continue the insurrection in times of coronavirus. And you can find, this is in France, the fact is that the strike and the fight is not quarantined as the people are. So this is a very brief and very quick illustration of what can be found on the different channels, on different platforms used by the different brand of extremism when it comes to coronavirus. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for this presentation that highlighted the way both jihadist, global terrorist, global jihadist group, as well as far left and far right extremist group are communicating. Telegram is a major channel through which these groups are getting the message across. You also mentioned the use of technology, and we can, for those who were not able to attend a webinar last week, we talked about the good uses, but also the malicious uses of technology. And here, Jean-Paul, you highlighted the way 3D printing could be used to 3D print guns, and how these groups are using this technology to promote that kind of development. The next speaker is Jean-Pierre Keller, also from TJAC. Jean-Pierre.
Hello, everyone. Okay, let's start. So I will focus myself on the northeast of Syria, give you an overview about what's happening in the camps and what's happening in the prisons and also on the fields. Give you a brief overview. Northeast of Syria, it's 4 million people, 600,000 internal displaced population, now 9 out of 11 hospitals being damaged during the last years of war, basically with poor technical infrastructure. They had only 40 ventilators, 35 ICU beds. For Syria, what about COVID in Syria for the time being? We've been reported the first case on March 22, first fatality case on March 29, as a total case for the time being roughly 50. Why so much? Why so less, I would say? Well, only 1,200 tests has been conducted so far in the capital Damascus, and very few elsewhere. While few numbers, absence of testing, obviously, absence of testing capabilities, even some donors like China, Russia, the US may send or going to send some test kits like masks, also gloves or respirators. One can also say that the use of the Syrian population or the warm weather could be as a reduction factor. Obviously, increased food price, panic buying like we had also in our countries, disrupted supply routes as borders remain closed with Turkey and or Iraq, slow replenishment of stocks and movement restrictions are symptoms affecting the poorest and the vulnerable people first. So let's go now within the North Syria camps. So basically we are going to speak about two camps, Al-Hol and Al-Roj, which are the two famous and most densified. You see some numbers now. Well, basically following the October 9th, 2019 aftermath, almost all medical facilities were suspended in those camps. You can easily imagine what it means for camp like Al-Hol, where 65,000 people are kept, and some are only women and kids. Even though we had also seen some transfer to the so-called third country nationals from Al-Hol to Al-Roj, it's still an overcrowded camp. The situation for detainees remains very desperate and homeless. Wave of panic sparks already as the coronavirus, well, start to spread within the camps? Is it already hard to wash their hands on a normal time if it's even harder now with the virus and the hygiene conditions being due? Due to this concern about the pandemic, few people may visit the camps again, so the medical treatment and basic health are very poor. As WHO stated, any areas with large group of people, such as camps and or cities, hosting mass gathering are of greater concern. And again, another aspect to look at are the illicit communication and exchange between the camps residents, the smugglers, and or ISIS fighters could easily exacerbate the spread of this virus. Let's look to and face the prisons now. And we are going to talk about Asake prisons for the time being. Sorry, here we are. So on an ongoing research that we are currently done with our two colleagues, Hafez and Faisal, as for camp, prisons share exactly the same common denominator: vulnerability to non-existent health standards, therefore a vital ground for spreading the virus. Incidents have been recurrent in countries not maintaining health standards. Obviously, as disease develop easily with a constrained space, prisoners are an easy targets. On March 30, we had already a riot start in the Hasake prison, where 5,000 IS fighters are detained for the time being. You will see now the conditions where they are. In total, you have to know that SDF have 10,000 under their control. The surprising coincide with mounting fears across the region that the coronavirus will arrive in this ravaged area, but apparently it was also due to some of the detainees having tuberculosis, which is a common bad prison conditions. As SDF, IS fighters are in constant tension, analyzing project an explosion of the situation, especially as the COVID-19 will amplify the tension. It is a if, but might be a when. So what will be the strategy in the future for both IS and probably the intel services or the coalitions? IS will encourage its members and supporters not to show mercy to Western countries, but rather continue to attack and exploit their weakness in these times. Opportunity for them to also gain support, as sometimes corrupt, inefficient, poorly resourced, managed by governments fail to provide adequate care for already distressful population. So the COVID-19 has uncovered the weakness of those who claim to be the superpowers of this world, such as the US, UK, and or France. As some of those troops are now deployed and stretched in their capacities, if not reduced, they become easy targets, as those troops are already preoccupied with protecting their own population, even not themselves. So again, for ISIS, is the destruction seen as an opportunity. The virus handicapped also domestic security efforts and intelligence counter-IS cooperation. The coalition is already pulling back from the fields, halting training activities, as well for the Middle East and or for the African military units. As for the intelligence community, it's also affected by the lockdown. So the strategic collection will be lighter, as one of the key challenges will be to attract human intelligence in area with active outbreaks, significant restrictions or travels. So we do have different scenarios as IS high-ranking members and leadership are taking COVID-19 seriously. They might be attacked. They may become more decentralized. So that means avoiding the foot soldier to have access to the main high-ranking members. Could be low-ranking members can fear contracted the virus themselves, so attacks could diminish. Or as we saw already in Mali a few days ago, attacks can be even more on the rise as IS will then take the opportunity to embark in the fields emptied by the coalition. So this is it for my part, and I will take questions with pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. So presented the view and the case study from Syria, and you highlighted the situation in prisons as well as the camp, and then the opportunities that the Islamic State could actually find in this crisis, and you ended up by saying that, well, probably this crisis forced decentralization that could lead to potential increase in attack if there are opportunities for that, or it could also lead to the opposite. The last speaker is Munir. Munir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody's attention and patience. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So what we've heard basically are various strategic and operational issues that some of these groups are going to face and are facing. My focus is looking specifically at jihadist stroke Islamist type networks and organizations, and perhaps what they are having to contend with and will be contending with post-COVID-19. Basically, to keep this as short and as simple as possible, what you've got is a macro level view here. And if I point the audience to, we start here at strategic issues, an overview suggests what does the pandemic do to the desired objectives of violent extremist groups. And I think this is an important point straight off the bat in terms of strategy, because all VEOs, jihadists, right wing, left wing, whatever their ideological inclination may be, have end state objectives, something that they seek to achieve, some aim or some decisive condition. Now, just like many liberal democracies, governments, countries, and nations have been caught completely, relatively by surprise by this pandemic, so too have violent extremist organizations, including jihadist groups. That doesn't mean to say that their communication has been non-existent, because you've seen the evidence of that earlier. But the point here is the impact of the pandemic surely impacts the strategic objectives of these groups. And so we will have to wait and see post-COVID-19 what their new terrain looks like for them in terms of what they want to achieve. Now, if I move you on to this side, alongside the strategic issues, then there's the issue of how they will look at what we call in economics a cost-benefit analysis. They will have to assess their possible gains versus possible losses in everyday needs and issues within this context. So in other words, where can they take risks? What risk may lead to a reward for them? What type of reward are they looking for? How does risk or cost or benefit impact recruitment, and how does it impact retention? Now, on the other side of this situation, we move down to another issue that's very important in this context, and that's around framing. So here we've got creating references. These groups and organizations will need to think about what references they're using. And what I mean by that, which ones are going to be more effective. For example, they need the right framing for a reference around how did they reinforce their central ideological message? Does the message change because of the situation they found themselves in? And that leads me to the second point there, which says contextualizing the pandemic and their cause. So in other words, unless they can frame their messaging in a way that gives context to what their cause is about in relation to COVID-19, they may find that they don't have a very active audience. And one of the ways in which this happens is through things you've already quickly just come across, but I've put here appropriating the situation to create a sense of ownership over the narrative. And a very harsh version of that is in brackets, i.e. one of the initial narratives that came out was the pandemic is a punishment. Not a punishment for the true believer, but a punishment for the non-believer, those who we fight against, for example. So this issue around framing becomes very, very important when both jihadist groups, violent extremist organizations have been caught by surprise, just like everybody else. If we move on a bit we've got to this stage. This means that they require a period of rationalizing. Now, from a psychology perspective, this is called sense making. They are going to need to make sense of what's going on around them. And you've heard some of this stuff, but I'll just recap it. So you've got narratives such as conspiracy theories. You've got narratives that form as a result of grievances because of perhaps issues that certain communities are facing because of COVID-19 and others may not be facing. You've got the always existent narratives of violent extremist groups that will play on the issue of oppression of some groups, of some particular subsection of a population that is being oppressed. And finally, as a result of using some of these, some organizations, networks, groups may seek to use action narratives. So what do we do about this grievance? What do we do about the fact that we believe this is a conspiracy? Or what do we do about the fact that our brothers and sisters are being oppressed? Once you move past the rationalizing stage, once you've made sense of COVID-19 and your objectives, you move to perhaps, potentially an issue around repurposing. What does repurposing mean in this context? Well, what's the effect of the pandemic on these groups' plans, on their logistics, on their finances, on how they recruit, who they recruit, on what tools and mediums they use for engagement, which ones will be more effective when people are already living in fear, and ultimately how these effects might also impact on the group or network's branding, how it comes across, the public, security and government perception of what this group or organization or network is trying to say. And you've seen high glossy quality content already presented to you here that some networks have put out, and you see some very basic quality content. So these are issues that they're going to have to think about, and they are thinking about. Do we effectively repurpose what we stand for to make the best out of the COVID-19 situation? And then moving here onto the left-hand side of the screen, what's the individual considerations that perhaps supporters or those who have not made up their mind, those who are indifferent to these narratives, what are the issues they're facing? These networks also have to consider that. So the impact of the pandemic on motivation levels, on support levels, passive or active, on levels of recruitment, perhaps different places for recruitment. They have to take into account the psychological context, individual level. How more or less vulnerable are the existing populations? If we just put out a narrative that says, if you do your ablution 5 times a day, you can't catch COVID-19, will this convince some people that we are on the right path or the straight path, for example? They have to look at the priorities of individuals who are trying to stay alive during a very serious situation. So if someone says, you know, we must enjoin the good and forbid the evil, a response may be from someone who's on lockdown to say, I'm actually just trying to stay alive. So can we talk about this another time if I manage to make it out of here? And then we're looking at ideas around how more or less resilient or receptive to the cause may individuals be who are fighting to stay alive at this moment in time and do not have other opportunities to think about their great calling in life that may be some kind of some kind of version of jihad or fighting. Now, where this leads us to, for example, very quickly, is we're looking at the issue from cause versus context. What would be the best strategy in the circumstances for a violent extremist group? This is something that we often don't consider on our side of the fence, but when you realize, or when you quickly think about government responses to COVID-19 and how some have appeared to be very disjointed, please do not think for 1 minute that the violent extremist organizations aren't as disjointed in the minimum as our own authorities may be. So they are also thinking about method. What's the best way in which, does our modus operandi change? Do our tactics change? They therefore have to make decisions, and these decisions may be based on what is the best thing for us in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, if we want our ideological objectives to survive. You know, we have to make the right decision now. We've got to be seen to be positive, or we've got to be seen to be able to recruit more numbers or be able to carry out more operations. And some of those decisions will be based on accurate or useful reading of the global temperature. What's going on? What's the sentiment? How are communities, societies, a nation's feeling. And as a result of that reading of the global temperature, then comes the ultimate decision for groups that have lost territories, for groups that have lost resources. For example, do we use this time to rebuild more quietly, or do we use this time to react suddenly and with force? And in conclusion, where that leaves us is a situation that in any such ideological context of Islamist or jihadist context, there is always a personal perspective to recruitment, support, and action. There's always a public or communal level of this support, action, and understanding, and there's always an ideological level of support, understanding, and action. And so the decision to rebuild or react has to be based on those three factors if any violent extremist organization or non-violent extremist organization is seeking to survive a situation where the rest of the world is surviving, trying to survive as well, because ironically, they too are human beings and are deep down being affected by the virus. So some of these strategic and operational things, I hope, have helped frame some of the considerations that they might be looking at. And coming last is never easy, but I thank you for your patience in listening to that, and I hope some of that was useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Munir. So you presented a very rational framework to try to make sense of how this movement can react to this crisis, and you started from the assumption that as governments, they were also caught by surprise, and in a way they have to reinvent themselves. And I think that you ended up by saying that, well, they have to choose between rebuilding or reacting to this crisis, and that will depend on the rational analysis and the different factors that you presented. Thank you very much for this. Again, we have lots of questions, more than almost 40 questions that have been asked. All are pretty much relevant. It's always a difficult job for Ashley to pick and choose. So as time passes, we'll probably go for one round of question and answer. Ashley, if you would like to select a few questions.
Thanks, Jean-Marc, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your inputs. I'm trying to select the most burning questions and some that have been asked a few different times in a few different ways. So my first question is kind of grouped together for Munir and for Andrea from Rafael Edu. So thank you to the panelists. You've clearly pointed out how extremists are taking advantage of the ongoing pandemic. But do you see any hope in terms of good practices and this as a prevention from extremists carrying out their actions? Thank you.
Shall I go first, Munir?
Please do.
Thank you for the question. I believe both me and Munir more of the operational level have mentioned several ways in which we can develop our strategies and kind of prevent the extremist groups from taking action now when we are already hit by a pandemic. But yeah, first of all, I think if there are some of the ideas I have said I can choose in order to answer the question would be first to understand the situation from both perspectives, both us as the guys who are now hit by pandemics, but we are also seen as the enemies for them. And them, because as Munir has pointed out really well, is the fact that they were hit by a pandemic as well. It's not just as we get infected and they are not getting infected. So we have to understand how this situation unfolds on both sides, and then kind of track the steps that they might do the first. And this is where I would like to point out or to emphasize the fact that what we need to do now more than ever before, because we proved not to be very good at this, we have to be one step ahead. I know it's harder now when we have so many things on our plate, but we need to be one step ahead. And the only way we can do it is by monitoring and understanding them deep inside, like deep from their own strategies, from their own groups. So this would be my answer. Munir, I'm passing it to you right now.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Yeah, it's a very good question. And a couple of things come to mind immediately. Firstly, if we as in this audience, practitioners, policymakers, academics, if we take our eye off the ball for 1 second, given that we are under very extreme conditions, us taking our eye off the ball will give these groups and networks the one window of opportunity they seek. And so actually, inadvertently, we may be one of the decisive factors in the re-emergence of certain narratives, actions, and ideologies. And secondly, at a very granular level, at a very individual level, basically, if we are talking about fear a lot, then we are no longer talking about hope. And one of the things that diasporas and communities desperately will need to inoculate themselves against narratives of hate and extremism would be narratives of hope and unity. And although that sounds wishy-washy, the issue is when you're fighting for survival against an unknown or invisible disease and pandemic, hope becomes a very tangible resource for people to hold on to. So I think those efforts, again, in the short, medium, and long term, for us all to be part of, would be one of the biggest obstacles for violent extremist organizations to get round. They would struggle to get round that. But if we stop, once lockdown ends and we go about our business as if it never happened, then so will they.
Thank you, Munir and Andrea. The second round of questions is directed to Christian and Christina. A few jumbled together. Will the economic issues continue to fuel far-right extremism? And if so, what is the balance of freedom of speech within that? As well as how can we tackle the rise of recruitment? And specifically for Christian, if you could say a couple of sentences on what has favored disengagement from the extremist path. What helped disengage? Thank you.
Sure. Christina, if you don't mind. I think I'll tackle the last question first. What helps people disengage? I think ultimately it is kind of destroying the demonization that they had, but it is not a logical argument that changes their mind. It's typically an emotional feeling that starts the transition process, which is why I never argue with extremists. I never debate them. You cannot win an illogical argument using logic, no matter how much you try. So it has to be a feeling. So I try to put people in situations that challenge the way they feel, the way they think. And then typically I allow them to vocalize that they're changing first, that they're feeling some confusion, and then I try to add to that a little bit more. So a little bit of cognitive dissonance building, but also trying to destroy the propaganda that demonizes people through kind of feeling. Ashley, tell me the first part of that question again.
How will the economic issues that people are facing continue to fuel extremism? And is there a balance of freedom of speech there?
Yeah, I think going back to uncertainty, in times of uncertainty, that's when extremism flourishes. So if we're having, socioeconomic issues and adding to that, it's going to add more to the uncertainty. So they use those moments of confusion to really try and recruit people over to their side with their narrative. So I would say, in order for us to combat this, truth is very, very important. Information, especially, in relation to COVID-19, that is truthful is important, and trying to limit the amount of disinformation and misinformation that's floating around out there. But again, sometimes that starts from the top. In my country, sometimes some of the disinformation comes from the very top. So it's going to be tricky, but I think there's never been a more important time for truth than now, because I fear that once we lose truth, we may not know how to find it again, because we may not know what it looks like. So it's very important to defend that now.
Thank you. Christina, if you may also tag on to some of those questions, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I guess I'll start with how will it impact, how will the economics impact the far right? I think one of the big issues, of course, will be food insecurity. One of the things that they've called for is to attack hospitals, but another one was to attack places where people shop. And I think this is, of course, something that would cause a quite difficulty and could create more and more people to join. But what I thought was really, really helpful and nice about what Munir said is it's all about showing good leadership, presenting human solidarity, and being honest about where the crisis is moving, how the crisis is evolving. We just had a really great presentation this morning at the Geneva Center for Security Policy by David Horobin, who talked about how should we deal with crisis responses in the time of COVID-19. And one of the things he highlighted is that governments need to know, to be truthful with their polity about what the threat is and how it will evolve, and also show them a beacon of hope. And I think to show that they are in charge, because the minute governments start polarizing communities, telling governors to do certain things and other states to do other things, you will have a weakness in governance, and this will give room for these groups to evolve. Thank you.
If I may just add, Christina mentioned David Arbin, who is the head of global of crisis management at the GCSP. He was one of the speakers at the first episode of this webinar series. If you want to hear what he has to say, please, you can watch the first episode. Ashley, back to you.
Thanks, Jean-Marc, and thank you everybody already. My next round of question is to Jean-Pierre and Jean-Paul. What countries do you think Al-Qaeda and ISIS will exploit most during this time? And can you express a bit more on what has their responses been? Jean-Pierre, can I ask you as well to elaborate a bit perhaps on the gendered effect, as you've just recently written a publication on women and children? Thank you.
Okay, Ashley, to answer your questions, what countries they will exploit most? There's something very interesting when we consider what has been done in the last, let's say, 6 weeks by IS more than Al-Qaeda. If you look at IS in terms of propaganda, I mean, they have clearly focused on the official line, which was, about the COVID, which was clearly disseminated by another and by a couple of Nashir channels, the official channels of the Islamic State. But if you look at think the other way around, if you look at the way the different so-called provinces, the wilayat, the way they have responded to the crisis, what we have seen is, just to put it this way, nearly business as usual. In other words, if you look at what is published by the channels that will report on what's happening in Wilayat Iraq or in Wilayat Sham or in West Africa, you will see that what they do report is operations. In other words, it feels like it is, for the moment, at least from the dissemination of propaganda perspective, business as usual. So I think here we are not yet seeing the consequences of the COVID crisis on the different, let's say, sub-branches of the Islamic State. So where will they be more, let's say, hit? Well, there will be the biggest amount of repercussions for the moment remains to be seen. And frankly, what is a big surprise for the moment is the total lack of reaction on both the African and the Asian side when it comes to their response to the COVID crisis. We've seen a couple of things in Syria and in Iraq. The second point concerning the way they do answer, again, we have seen the official answer, which is clearly protect yourself. If you are positive, just make sure you will not contaminate other Muslims, other fighters, whatever. And the question of attacks for the moment is clearly not the major point. It's not the idea of weaponizing, at least from IS perspective, weaponizing the virus is not yet something that is seriously discussed on the different channels and the different platforms that are monitored. So this, for me, remains clearly an open question. But again, we will see in the coming weeks, in the coming 2 weeks, the way the COVID has hit and the way they will have to answer. to the actual crisis. But for the moment, I would say we still do not see it on either side from any part of the so-called IS different provinces. Thank you, Ashley.
Well, on my side, concerning the gender issues, you understood easily that most of those women, basically the foreigners women with their kids, are held into overcrowded camps with poor sanity, very poor sanitary conditions, basic medical needs which are not there. And this brings them to raise their hands and ask for their brothers to help them and help them to get out of camps. So we do have already some smuggling activities, whereas foreign fighters, women, were able to flee those camps and were able to either join back IS or cross the borders into whereas Iraq or Turkey. So again, the major concerns there is that those kids are still under their facilities and are still under their radicalized voices and propagandas. And on top of that, there is no schools. So no schools, they learn nothing unless what their mother told, and that's the end of the game for them. Being alone in a camp, being an environment not healthy at all, under again the heaviest propaganda of some of those women being into those camps. So this is really something frightening, and this is something that the international community has to face. So having said that, some of the countries already have done some repatriation of kids throughout the world, but very few at this stage, and don't mention it, but some of those women, some of those mothers will not allow their kids to leave the camps without them. So it's a big bargain for the time being. Either we can save those children, or are we going to leave them down there?
Thank you to all of you. Jean-Marc, I have a notification that time is running out. So thank you, everybody. Over to Jean-Marc very quickly.
Sure, thank you very much for this great panel, and I think that there are so many issues that were raised, but I think that one of the key takeaway is that the issue of uncertainty and the need for information that is trusted, truthful, and combating disinformation, because disinformation creates uncertainty and it leads to chaos. So thank you very much for this. I know there were lots of questions. The good news is that the TJAC will actually publish a paper based on this webinar that will take into account your questions. So to be aware, listen of what we're doing, you can log on our website, gcsp.ch. You can also watch all the previous webinar. And we will meet next week, 1 hour later, because topic next week will be on US power and foreign relations, especially transatlantic relations. So we'll start at 4 p.m. Geneva time, so that our American viewers will be able to join us not too early in the morning. Until then, stay safe, and I will see you next week. Thank you.